The sun hung high over the plains, baking the earth until it cracked like old leather. Temperance Calloway stood on the porch of her small homestead, her hands curled into fists at her sides as 3 riders emerged from the dust. Harlan McCready, his hat tilted low and a smirk carved into his weathered face, led the way. Cassius Boone, wiry and sharp-eyed, rode beside him, and Virgil Tate, the biggest and meanest of the bunch, lagged just behind. She didn't need an introduction. She knew exactly who they were, and why they were here. Harlan dismounted first, moving slow, like a rattlesnake that knew it had all the time in the world before striking. "Well, if it ain't Widow Calloway," he drawled, tipping his hat. Temperance didn't flinch. "Whatever you think you're owed, you won't find it here." Cass let out a low chuckle, his boots kicking up dust as he stepped forward. "Ain't about what we think, ma'am. It's about what's right. Jed owed us, and he ain't around to pay his debts." Harlan clicked his tongue, fake sympathy dripping from his voice. "Now, Tempe, we ain't unreasonable men. We'll take what's fair. Your horses, your supplies, maybe that rifle your husband left behind." The shot came without warning. A single, brutal crack that tore through the silence like a lightning strike. Her old dog, Buck, collapsed in the dirt, his body still before he even hit the ground. Temperance sucked in a breath, but no sound came out. The rage that filled her then was quiet, steady, the kind of fury that don't burn out easy. She didn't move when they shoved past her, ransacking her home like vultures picking a carcass clean. She didn't move when they saddled her horses and rode off, trailing dust behind them. But when the last hoofbeat faded into the distance, she stepped off that porch and walked inside, straight to the hidden corner behind the kitchen cabinet where Jed's old shotgun still waited, cool and heavy in her hands. They thought they could rob a widow and ride away without a care. They thought wrong. The wind carried the scent of dust and burnt wood as Temperance Calloway sat at her kitchen table, the shotgun resting across her lap. The house was silent now, too silent. The walls still held the echoes of men who had no right to be here, their laughter rattling in her ears like a bad memory. The floorboards bore their muddy boot prints, a trail of filth leading to every corner of the home she had built with Jedediah. But what unsettled her most was the chair at the far end of the table, Jed's chair, left pushed back, as if he had just gotten up and would be back any second. Only he wouldn't. And now, neither would they. She stood slowly, her joints aching, not from age but from the weight of what she was about to do. A woman alone in the West had 2 choices, bend or break. But there was a third choice too, the one her husband had taught her long ago, the one she had pushed aside in favor of a quiet life. The choice to fight. Temperance walked out onto the porch, the wooden steps groaning beneath her weight. She scanned the horizon, eyes narrowing against the glare. She knew exactly where Harlan McCready and his men would go. They weren't the type to disappear into the night. No, men like that needed whiskey, women, and a place to brag about what they'd done. And there was only one place in 50 miles where they could find all 3. The Black Spur Saloon. A gust of wind swept through, lifting the hem of her skirt as she stepped off the porch and made her way to the barn, or what was left of it. The bastards had torched most of it, but they hadn't found the hidden stall in the back, where her mare, Pearl, stood waiting. She ran a steady hand down the horse's neck, whispering calm reassurances as she saddled up. She hadn't ridden in years, not like this. Not with purpose. Not with a mind set on vengeance. As she swung up into the saddle, the shotgun resting in its scabbard along her leg, there was no hesitation left in her. The town was half a day's ride away, and she wasn't sure what she would do when she got there. But one thing was certain. Harlan McCready and his men had made a mistake. They had left her breathing. And before the sun set tomorrow, they would regret it. The night stretched endless and black over the open desert, broken only by the pale glow of the moon and the distant flicker of lanterns in town. Temperance Calloway rode with purpose, her spine straight, her hands firm on the reins, the cold steel of her shotgun pressing against her leg like a promise. Every hoofbeat against the hard-packed dirt echoed in her bones, pounding in rhythm with the fury she kept locked behind her ribs. The men who had stolen from her thought they had left her for dead. By sunrise, they would be the ones staring into the dark. She wasn't a fool. Revenge wasn't something you rushed. It wasn't a reckless bullet fired in anger, wasn't a wild charge through swinging saloon doors. It was patient, calculated, precise. The same way a snake doesn't strike until the moment is right, she wouldn't make a move until she had the upper hand. That was something Jed had taught her all those years ago, back when she still believed she could leave violence behind. The Black Spur Saloon sat on the far edge of town, the kind of place where the law didn't bother stepping foot unless it was to collect bodies. Yellow light poured from its windows, casting long shadows on the dust-choked street. Laughter and the twang of a battered piano spilled into the night, mingling with the thick scent of whiskey, cigar smoke, and sweat. She could feel them inside. Harlan McCready, Cass Boone, Virgil Tate, laughing, drinking, spending her money like they had earned it. Temperance guided Pearl off the main road, keeping to the shadows as she tied the mare to a post behind the livery. She moved slow, adjusting the weight of the shotgun in her hands, rolling her shoulders to loosen the tension building there. She had spent the last 10 years pretending she was just a widow, just a woman living quiet and alone. Tonight, she stopped pretending. As she stepped onto the wooden boardwalk outside the saloon, the sound of her boots against the planks was swallowed by the noise inside. The din of drunken voices rose and fell in a chaotic hum, but through the mess of it, she caught a familiar voice, Harlan's, cutting through the crowd like a blade. "Easy as robbing a dead man's pocket," he was saying, his voice thick with amusement. "Didn't even put up a fight. Took everything but her damn rocking chair." Laughter followed, loud and ugly. The clinking of coins. The unmistakable pop of a bottle being uncorked. Temperance took a breath, steadying herself. The time for patience was over. She pushed open the saloon doors, stepping inside like a shadow slipping into the room. The warmth of whiskey, sweat, and tobacco clung to the air. The laughter began to die. One by one, heads turned toward the entrance. And at the center of it all, Harlan McCready froze, a bottle halfway to his lips, staring at the last woman he ever expected to see standing in his doorway. The Black Spur Saloon had seen its share of trouble. Fistfights over a spilled drink, bullets flying over a bad hand of poker, men gutted with a Bowie knife for looking too long at another man's woman. But tonight, the trouble that walked through its doors was something different. Something quiet, something cold, something that didn't come with a shout but with a promise written in steel and blood. Temperance Calloway stepped inside like she owned the place, like she had all the time in the world, like she wasn't walking into a pit of wolves who had already taken everything from her once. The moment she crossed the threshold, the noise began to die. The whiskey-soaked laughter, the bark of voices from men too deep in their cups to care who was listening. All of it faded, swallowed by the weight of something no one in that room could quite name. At the center of it all sat Harlan McCready. He lounged in his chair, a bottle of bourbon dangling from his fingers, the lamplight casting jagged shadows across the hard angles of his face. Cass Boone, his smirking right hand, sat beside him, one boot propped up on the edge of the table, a half-smoked cigar clenched between his teeth. Virgil Tate, the brute of the bunch, leaned back against the bar, a glass of whiskey in one hand, his free hand resting on the handle of the knife strapped to his belt. They looked like men who had won, like men who weren't expecting trouble. Harlan was the first to break the silence. He exhaled, slow and amused, before taking a lazy sip from the bottle. "Now, if this ain't a sight. Thought we left you sittin' in the dirt, Tempe." He set the bottle down with a dull thunk, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Seems we didn't hit you hard enough." Temperance didn't answer, didn't flinch, didn't blink. Instead, she took another step forward, then another, her boots scuffing against the floor in a slow, deliberate rhythm. She wasn't rushing. She wanted them to feel it. The weight of what was coming. The weight of her. She stopped just short of their table, her fingers tightening around the shotgun resting in the crook of her arm. She could see it now, the hesitation. Cass Boone's smirk was still there, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Virgil shifted, his fingers twitching against the handle of his knife. Harlan? Harlan was still grinning. But there was something behind it now, something small, something sharp. Recognition. A knowing. She let them sit in the silence. Let them feel it wrap around their throats. And then, at last, she spoke. "You took my horses." Her voice didn't waver, didn't rise. It was flat, cold. Like the steel of the shotgun, she lifted, slow and steady, until the barrel was pointed straight at Cass Boone's chest. "You took my money." Cass shifted, his fingers twitching toward his holster. "You took my food." Harlan's grin widened, but his hand crept toward his belt. "And you shot my dog." The room held its breath. Her finger rested on the trigger. Cass Boone's smirk flickered, the first real crack in his mask. His jaw clenched. His hand hovered over his gun. And in that moment she saw it, saw what kind of man he was. A bully, a thief, a killer. The kind of man who only pulled a trigger when he knew his target wasn't going to shoot back. She tilted her head slightly, her grip steady. "Go on," she said, her voice like iron. "Draw." The saloon felt smaller now. The air, thick with whiskey and cigar smoke, had turned suffocating. Every man in the room had stopped whatever he was doing. Cards were left half-played, drinks sat untouched on the bar, and the piano player, hands hovering over the keys, didn't dare strike another note. Every eye was on Temperance Calloway, and the shotgun aimed square at Cass Boone's chest. Cass's smirk was gone. His fingers twitched near his holster, but they didn't move, at least, not yet. He was fast, and he knew it. But he also knew that a shotgun at this range didn't require speed. Didn't matter how quick he was, how smooth his draw, if she pulled that trigger, he'd be a hole in the floor before his gun even cleared leather. Harlan McCready, still lounging back in his chair, exhaled through his nose, the barest hint of amusement flickering in his dark eyes. Now, Tempe. Let's not do something we can't take back." His voice was slow, measured, like he was speaking to a skittish horse. His fingers drummed lazily against the table, but she didn't miss the way his other hand had crept closer to his gun. Temperance didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her grip on the shotgun was steady, her shoulders squared. "Funny," she said, her voice as cold as the steel in her hands. "I was about to say the same to you." A slow, creeping tension spread through the saloon like the first crack of ice on a frozen river. Virgil Tate shifted uneasily, his massive frame tight with something just shy of fear. Cass Boone swallowed hard, his jaw ticking. But Harlan? Harlan just smiled, a slow, knowing grin that sent a chill down her spine. Then, in the space of a breath, everything snapped. Cass went for his gun. The shotgun roared. The blast tore through the saloon like thunder, and Cass Boone barely had time to register the pain before he was knocked backward, crashing into the table behind him. A dark, wet stain spread across his chest, the hole in his vest smoking. His gun, still half-drawn, clattered to the floor beside his twitching fingers. His mouth opened, like he had something to say, but no words came. Just a wet, gasping sound, then nothing. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. Harlan McCready didn't move. Virgil Tate stared, his hand frozen on the handle of his knife. The rest of the saloon was deathly still, every man weighing his next move very carefully. Temperance took a slow step forward, the shotgun still aimed, still steady. Her voice was even when she spoke. "That's for my dog." The sound of Cass Boone hitting the floor hadn't even settled before chairs scraped, boots shifted, and hands twitched toward holsters. The entire saloon felt like a stick of dynamite with the fuse already burning. But nobody moved. Nobody wanted to be the first to die. Harlan McCready was the only one still smiling. Slow and easy, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his fingers interlaced like a man about to say grace. The grin on his face wasn't one of amusement. It was something sharper, something cruel. "Well now," he drawled, tapping a finger against his belt buckle. "I suppose we all just learned a valuable lesson, didn't we?" Temperance didn't lower the shotgun, didn't let herself breathe too deep. She knew this game. She'd seen it played before. Harlan wasn't the kind of man to let something like this slide, but he also wasn't the kind of fool to go out in a blaze of gunfire if he could help it. He was a snake, waiting for the right moment to strike. Virgil Tate shifted. Slowly, deliberately, his chair creaked as he leaned forward, his massive hands resting on his knees. He wasn't as clever as Harlan, but he was big, and he was mean, and he was still alive. "Ain't no call for that, miss," he rumbled, his voice low and dangerous. "Cass was a dumb son of a bitch, sure. But you didn't have to kill him." Temperance's gaze snapped to him. "He drew first." Virgil rolled his shoulders, cracking his thick neck. "Maybe. But now you got a problem." A slow, sinking feeling settled in her gut. She knew what was coming before he even said it. "You see," Virgil continued, flexing his fingers, "you just made an orphan outta his little brother." A rustling noise came from the far side of the room. A man barely out of boyhood, a gangly, sunburned thing with wide, furious eyes, pushed himself up from a dark corner. His hand shook as it hovered near the pistol strapped to his hip. "You killed my brother," the boy stammered, his voice high with something between rage and terror. Harlan exhaled, almost lazily. Now, Bo, let's not be hasty." But the smirk on his face said otherwise. He wanted this. He wanted the kid to be stupid. Temperance's stomach turned cold. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about survival. If she fired again, it wouldn't stop at one body this time. The whole saloon would erupt. And she wasn't sure she'd walk out. Bo Boone's breath was ragged, his fingers trembling near the grip of his revolver. His brother lay dead at his feet, the barrel of Temperance Calloway's shotgun still warm. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, darted between her and Harlan McCready, who sat calm as ever, watching the moment unfold like a man with a winning hand. The kid wanted revenge. That much was clear. But wanting it and taking it were two different things. The saloon was silent. Virgil Tate barely moved, his massive hands resting on his knees, watching like a wolf waiting for the right moment to strike. The other patrons, drifters, gamblers, hired guns, held their places, waiting to see how the cards would fall. Harlan had orchestrated this perfectly. If the kid drew, Temperance would have to kill him. If she hesitated, he'd kill her. Either way, the room would explode into chaos, and Harlan would walk out untouched. Temperance kept her shotgun steady, her voice low and even. "You ain't your brother, kid." Bo swallowed hard, his hand twitching. "Shut up. You pull that gun, and you're dead before it clears the holster." She took a step closer, slow, deliberate. "And for what? To impress him?" She nodded toward Harlan, whose smirk barely faltered. But for the first time, Bo hesitated. That was all the time Virgil Tate needed. The moment snapped. Virgil lunged, a blade flashing in the dim saloon light. Temperance spun as the first gunshot cracked through the air. And just like that, Black Spur erupted into hell. The first gunshot split the air like a lightning strike, deafening in the tight space of the saloon. Virgil Tate lunged, his blade flashing in the lantern light, aiming straight for Temperance's ribs. But she was already moving. She twisted, felt the whisper of steel as it sliced through the air where she had been standing just a heartbeat before. The shotgun was too long for close quarters, so she did the only thing she could. She swung it like a club. The stock of the gun smashed into Virgil's jaw with a sickening crack. He stumbled, blood spraying from his mouth, but he wasn't down. Not yet. Temperance barely had time to breathe before the room exploded into chaos. Chairs scraped, boots thundered against the wooden floor, and the sharp scent of gunpowder filled her lungs. Men were reaching for their weapons, some out of loyalty, others just because they saw an opportunity for a fight. She dove behind an overturned table just as another gun fired, the bullet punching through the wood inches from her head. Boone was still standing in the middle of it all, his revolver drawn, but his hands were shaking. His face was pale, his eyes darting between his dead brother and the mayhem around him. He was drowning in his own hesitation. Across the room, Harlan McCready hadn't moved. He sat there, calm as a rattlesnake, waiting for the right moment to strike, watching the fight unfold with an almost lazy interest. He wasn't a man who wasted bullets. He let others bleed for him. Temperance wasn't about to let him slither out of this one. She reached for the revolver at her hip, Jed's old Colt, the one she had sworn she wouldn't use again, and cocked the hammer back. She had come for justice, but she'd settle for vengeance. She rose from cover, aimed across the room, and locked eyes with Harlan. For the first time that night, the smile slipped from his face. The saloon had turned into a battlefield. Gunshots roared, chairs splintered, men cursed and fell, the thick smell of whiskey and blood mixing with the acrid stench of gunpowder. Temperance Calloway stood in the eye of the storm, her shotgun now empty, her breath sharp in her chest. She had come here for Harlan McCready. But now, if she didn't move fast, she wouldn't be leaving at all. Virgil Tate wiped the blood from his split lip and snarled like a wounded wolf. He wasn't down. He wasn't the type to stay down. His knife was still in his hand, the blade slick and glinting. He took a step forward, murder written in his eyes, and Temperance barely had time to draw her revolver before he lunged again. She fired. The first bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. The second buried itself deep in his gut. He gasped, stumbling back against the bar, his knife slipping from his fingers and clattering to the floor. He blinked at her like he couldn't believe she'd done it. Then he collapsed, dragging a row of whiskey bottles down with him. A flash of movement. Harlan. The bastard was slipping through the chaos, weaving between bodies, heading for the back door. He wasn't a fighter. He was a survivor. That's what men like him did. They let others die for them, and then they slithered away in the smoke. Not this time. Temperance surged forward, shoving past a man who was still struggling to reload his rifle. She saw Harlan push open the back door, disappearing into the night. Her heart pounded against her ribs. If he got to his horse, if he got away, this wouldn't be over. He'd rebuild. He'd come back. And next time, she wouldn't see him coming. She burst through the door after him, stepping into the cold desert air. Harlan was already mounting his horse, his hands tight on the reins, his pistol glinting at his hip. Their eyes met across the darkened alley. For the first time all night, Temperance saw something flicker behind that easy grin of his. Not amusement. Not confidence. Something colder. Fear. The desert stretched wide and empty behind Harlan McCready, the darkness swallowing the land in a silence so vast it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. His horse pawed at the dirt, restless, sensing his urgency. He had one boot in the stirrup, his fingers tightening on the reins, but his eyes were locked on Temperance Calloway. She stood in the alley's mouth, her revolver raised, the dull lamplight from the saloon casting long shadows behind her. Her hair was wild, loose from the fight, her clothes dust-covered and torn. But her grip was steady, her stance unshaken. Harlan grinned, but it was different now. It wasn't the smirk of a man in control. It was the forced smile of a gambler who just realized he was holding a losing hand. He still had a play left, though. "Ain't too late to let this go, Tempe," he called out, his voice smooth as ever, but she could hear the edges cracking. "You shoot me, and what happens next? You think they'll let a woman walk away after killing half the damn saloon?" Temperance didn't answer, didn't flinch. "You ain't no killer." Harlan shifted, his hand hovering near his pistol. But she was. She just hadn't accepted it until now. Harlan moved. Faster than she expected. His gun was out in a blink, but so was hers. The night split open with the crack of 2 gunshots. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Harlan swayed. His fingers loosened. The revolver slipped from his grip and thudded against the dirt. He took a slow, stumbling step back, confusion flickering across his face like he hadn't quite caught up to what had happened. Then he crumpled to his knees. Temperance walked toward him, slow and deliberate. He gasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his lips, his hand pressed against the dark stain spreading across his chest. He looked up at her, and for the first time, there was nothing left of the man who had swaggered into her home and taken everything from her. Harlan tried to speak, but no words came. Temperance holstered her revolver. She didn't need to hear whatever lie he had left. She turned and walked back toward the saloon, leaving him there, just another corpse beneath the cold desert sky. The black spur was wrecked. Broken chairs, shattered glass, the dead and dying scattered across the floor. No one spoke as she stepped inside. No one dared. She walked past Boone. The kid hadn't drawn. He just stood there, his hands still shaking, staring at his brother's body. She met his gaze for a brief second, but there was nothing left to say. Temperance kept walking. Past the bar. Past the blood-stained floorboards. Past the memories of the woman she used to be. Outside, Pearl was still waiting. She untied the reins, swung up into the saddle, and turned toward the open road. She didn't look back.